The Tycoon always believed he controlled everything, until that afternoon when a song stopped him in the hallway. The voice was soft, emotional, impossible to ignore. He followed the sound and found Maria, the maid everyone overlooked, singing quietly to his elderly mother. The room fell silent. Years of steel inside him began to crack. "Keep going," he whispered. Each note awakened memories he had buried for decades. For the first time in years, the Tycoon couldn't hold back his tears. But what he didn't know, what no one in that house suspected, was that this song hid a secret about Maria capable of changing everything and shattering completely the image he had of her. The Tycoon always believed he controlled everything, until that afternoon, when a song stopped him in the hallway. The voice was soft, emotional, impossible to ignore. He followed the sound and found Maria, the maid everyone overlooked, singing quietly to his elderly mother. The room fell silent. Years of steel inside him began to crack. "Keep going," he whispered. Each note awakened memories he had buried for decades. For the first time in years, the Tycoon couldn't hold back his tears. But what he didn't know, what no one in that house suspected, was that this song hid a secret about Maria capable of changing everything and shattering completely the image he had of her. The corridor outside his mother's wing was a study in deliberate calm, marble floors polished to silence, soft recessed lights warming the ivory walls, the faint scent of lemon oil in the air. Power lived here in invisible ways, not loud, not theatrical. It lingered in the absence of clutter, in the disciplined pace of every staff member who passed without lingering. Control was a language this house spoke fluently. He walked as he always did, shoulders back, posture precise, steps measured to the rhythm of decision. His phone pressed to his ear, a voice briefing him on contracts, timelines, risks. The words barely registered. His attention was fixed on projections, on dominance over numbers. The world responded to him in margins and signatures. It always had, until something unfamiliar threaded through the air. At first, it was barely more than a vibration, a fragile ribbon of sound slipping past the strict geometry of the hallway. His steps slowed without instruction from his mind. The voice on the call continued speaking, oblivious. The melody grew clearer with each second. Not loud, not performative, but intimate. The kind of sound that wasn't meant for corridors of wealth and glass. He stopped completely. For the first time in years, the future wasn't pulling him forward. The phone dropped slowly from his ear. He didn't end the call, just forgot it existed. The song carried emotion in its bones, not in its volume. Spanish words shaped carefully, tenderly, each syllable trembling, as if the singer feared breaking it. The sound tugged at something sealed behind layers of discipline he'd built across decades. He shouldn't have been affected. This was his house. Music played only when he commanded it. Staff kept quiet. Order was sacred. But this voice didn't ask permission. It slipped under rules and reached the parts of him trained to stay dormant. His throat tightened in irritation, not at the sound, but at himself. Curiosity was a weakness he rarely allowed. The door to his mother's room stood slightly open. A seam of warm light stretched across the floor, softer than the corridor's restrained glow. The atmosphere shifted subtly as he approached it, the sterile scent of cleaned stone giving way to lavender, fabric softener, faint traces of medicine. The world inside that room moved at a slower rhythm. He paused at the threshold. His mother lay asleep, smaller now, fragile beneath ivory sheets. The woman who once terrified boardrooms with a raised eyebrow now breathed shallowly, lips parted, face softened by age and surrender. The sight unsettled him more than he liked to admit. Beside the bed stood Maria. She wore the same navy uniform as always, the same modest apron tied around her waist, but nothing about her presence resembled invisibility in that moment. Her shoulders lifted and fell gently with the song. One hand held a damp cloth, resting idly near his mother's temple. The other pressed lightly against the bed frame, as if grounding herself. He had seen her dozens of times before. Never like this. Her voice carried quiet weight. It wasn't polished. It trembled in places, weakened by memory, but the emotion behind it was undeniable. The song spoke of night storms in safe hands, of a child protected by a promise no matter how dark the world became. The melody moved slowly, reverently, like something handed down rather than composed. His mother stirred. The smallest movement. A twitch of her fingers. A deeper breath. The machines whispered approval. Maria adjusted her position without breaking the song, instinctively aligning herself with the fragile rhythm of the older woman's breathing. The sound wasn't entertainment. It was care. The Tycoon felt something inside him shift. Recognition crept in gently, dangerously. The tune brushed against a locked memory. He hadn't heard this lullaby in decades. Not since childhood. Not since the last fragile evenings of a life he never spoke about. His jaw tightened. The melody wasn't simply familiar. It was exact. The way Maria lingered on the final note of each line. The way her voice softened on the word cielo. Those choices weren't random. They matched the only person who had ever sung to him like that. His mother's lips parted. A name slipped from them, faint, nearly lost in breath. A name he hadn't heard spoken aloud since he was a boy. The sound struck him like cold water. His heart dropped violently against his ribs. His eyes burned before he could stop them. Maria's voice wavered for half a second, not from fear but from recognition. He took one step into the room. The floor didn't creak. The house was too well built for that, but Maria felt the shift in the air. She turned slowly, song fading into silence as their eyes met. The moment stretched, her gaze cautious, his unreadable. She lowered her head slightly, instinctively bracing for correction. "I apologize, sir," she said softly. She was restless. The nurse had stepped out. "I only meant to help." His mouth opened to speak. The correction formed automatically. The rules, the expectations, but the words detached, drifting away before leaving his throat. Instead, something else emerged. Something quieter. Unprotected. "Keep going," he said. The sound of his own voice surprised him. Maria hesitated. Her fingers tightened against the cloth. For a moment, the entire room waited in stillness, breath suspended between obedience and instinct. Then she looked at his mother again, drew in a breath, and the song resumed exactly where it had been cut. This time, he didn't fight it. The melody reached deeper now. It pulled images from places he'd buried under contracts and acquisitions. A cramped kitchen, rain against a rusted roof. A woman humming through exhaustion, shelter built not from walls, but from voice. His control began to fracture, not loudly, not visibly, but from the inside. Tears slipped free before he registered them. Maria saw them. Her voice softened even further, as if aware she was holding something fragile in her hands. The song shifted, now speaking of loss, of carrying grief without letting it crush love. His chest ached with understanding he hadn't allowed himself in years. And for the first time since his childhood, he was not the most powerful presence in the room. The final note lingered in the air like a held breath. Silence followed. Dense. Electric. He exhaled slowly. The house felt unfamiliar around him, as if it had rearranged itself while he wasn't looking. He studied Maria now with focused attention, not as staff, not as background, but as an unresolved question standing beside his past. "Where did you learn that song?" he asked quietly. Maria's eyes flickered, just for an instant. She swallowed. "My mother used to sing it," she answered. Something about the way she said it, measured, guarded, told him she wasn't giving the full truth. And in that moment, watching the quiet maid beside his sleeping mother, the Tycoon sensed that she was not simply part of his house. She was connected to it, in ways that could undo everything. The house did not return to normal after the song ended. Sound lingered where silence had reclaimed its place like an echo inside glass. The Tycoon remained by the door for several seconds longer than necessary, gaze still fixed on his mother's relaxed features. Maria moved quietly to adjust the blanket, her motions careful, reverent. The space between them was thick with unspoken questions neither was yet prepared to shape into words. He left without another comment. The hallway felt narrower on the return walk, the polished marble less secure under his feet. For the first time in years, the house seemed to be watching him instead of the other way around. Each step echoed slightly louder, as if his own presence had become unfamiliar. He passed framed photographs without seeing them, his thoughts drifting backward into corridors that did not belong to this estate. In the service wing, Maria stood alone beside a utility sink, hands submerged in warm water she no longer felt. The silence around her rang louder than the song ever had. Her pulse beat unevenly beneath her wrist. She replayed his eyes as they had met hers, not cruel, not detached, but shaken. Power unsettled was far more dangerous than power ignored. She had always known this moment would come. Not this way. Not with a song. That evening, the staff gathered in the long galley kitchen for their brief dinner rotation. Steel counters reflected tired faces. Someone turned on the radio low. No one spoke of what had happened upstairs, but the air pulsed with curiosity. Rumors traveled quickly in houses like this, faster than footsteps, quieter than fear. Maria kept her head down, conscious of glances skimming her profile. She felt eyes on her that had never lingered before. At the head of the table, the senior nurse stirred her soup with disinterest, too deliberate to be genuine. "The Tycoon hasn't stayed in your wing that long in years," she remarked coolly. "He barely visits her at all." Maria's spoon paused mid-motion. The nurse watched the reaction with subtle precision. Must have been some song. Maria offered nothing in return. Later that night, Maria returned to her small room at the edge of the staff floor. A narrow bed, a cheap dresser, one window facing a courtyard too deep to hear the city beyond. She locked the door with fingers that trembled more than she wanted to admit. From beneath folded uniforms, she drew out an old photograph tucked inside worn fabric. A young woman stood in its center, smiling. The resemblance was unmistakable. The same curve to the cheek. The same quiet strength in the eyes. The same mouth shaped by restraint rather than indulgence. Maria traced the woman's outline with her thumb and did not allow herself to cry. She had learned long ago that tears rarely solved what blood demanded. Upstairs, the Tycoon did not sleep. His bedroom was expansive, perfectly controlled in dark lines and muted tones. Floor-to-ceiling windows held the city captive under glass. Every surface reflected order. He sat at the edge of the bed, the echo of the song disturbing the stillness with relentless persistence. He could not escape it. Memory pressed against his sternum with unfamiliar weight. He summoned his head of security just after midnight. The man arrived promptly. Posture square, expression unreadable. "I want everything you can find on the maid who works my mother's wing," the Tycoon said calmly. "Name, background, employment history, family." The word lingered subtly in the air. The security chief nodded. No questions, only obedience. Investigation was control reclaimed. By morning, Maria felt the shift before she saw it. The security guard stationed near the service elevator watched her with curiosity sharpened into intent. His gaze followed her longer than professionalism allowed. She kept her stride steady, but sensing that attention awakened a familiar unease beneath her ribs. The house had changed its temperature overnight. She could feel it in the way doors closed behind her. In the breakfast room, sunlight fractured across silverware and porcelain. The Tycoon entered silently. Conversation died on impact. Staff aligned instinctively to the walls. Maria stood near the far counter, preparing tea. She felt him before she saw him. The weight of his presence altered the room's gravity. Their eyes met briefly. No accusation. No warmth. Only calculation. He took his seat beside his mother, who appeared weaker than the night before. Her eyes fluttered open at the sound of his voice. "You slept peacefully," he said, smoothing her hair in a gesture rarely witnessed. "You always loved music." The old woman looked toward Maria, confusion softening into something dangerously close to recognition. "Yes," she whispered. "She sings like her." The room froze. The Tycoon stiffened subtly. "Like who?" he asked. His mother's lips trembled as if struggling through fog. "The one who left," she murmured, barely audible. "The one you never forgave." Maria's grip tightened around the teacup. A memory ignited behind his eyes. Sharper, angrier than the lullaby had been gentle. He stood abruptly. Chairs scraped faintly in reflexive response. The staff instinctively dropped their gazes. He did not look at Maria again as he exited the room, but she felt something sever in the air when he passed. That afternoon, security delivered the first report. Maria Isabel Reyes, age 24. Employed through a third-party staffing agency with suspicious gaps in documentation. Mother listed as deceased, no listed father, education partial, no criminal record. But the background check flagged an unusual annotation buried deep in a closed adoption registry. The Tycoon read it twice. The annotation referenced a sealed record from 25 years earlier. Time frame aligning too precisely with a chapter of his life he rarely permitted himself to recall. His fingers tightened around the paper. The name on the sealed file was blurred through redaction, but its shadow pressed unmistakably against his conscience. He ordered the file opened. That evening, Maria returned to her mother's wing with steady hands. Her task list was unchanged. Sheets, medicine, quiet. But the halls began to feel like corridors of interrogation rather than refuge. She sensed the house learning her shape. She had lived long enough with this feeling to recognize its danger. When she reached the room, his mother was awake. The elderly woman's gaze softened when Maria entered. "You came back," she said with faint relief. "They always leave." Maria smiled gently and took her hand. The woman's grip lingered with surprising strength. "You remind me of someone." Maria did not ask who. She already knew. As Maria began wiping the bedside table, the old woman whispered, "He thinks I forgot everything. But some things wait." Maria felt the weight of those words settle heavily between them. The woman's eyes glistened. "Your song woke what sleep could not bury." Downstairs, a scream shattered porcelain. It came from the records room. Security scrambled. The Tycoon arrived moments later to find blood on paper, and a clerk collapsed over an overturned chair, alive but shaking violently. The opened adoption file lay spattered across the floor. The name at the top was no longer redacted. It was his. And it was hers. The house felt different the morning after the scream in the records room. The same polished marble gleamed. The same expensive stillness stretched along the corridors, yet something unseen had shifted inside its bones. Silence no longer meant control. It felt like a cover thrown hastily over something dangerous. The Tycoon stood at his study window, staring at his reflection superimposed over the city, the opened file waiting behind him like an accusation. He had not slept. Every time he closed his eyes, the image returned. Blood on paper, the clerk's shaking hands, the black letters finally visible where redacted ink had once ruled. A name that should not exist in that context, tethered to dates and signatures that lined up too precisely with a chapter of his life he had sealed off. Control, his oldest ally, had watched and stayed silent. Waiting, he finally turned from the glass and faced the desk. The file lay open, its edges too neat for what it contained. He didn't sit. Sitting felt like conceding something. Instead, he planted his hands on either side of the pages and leaned over them, forcing himself to read each line slowly. Emergency delivery, maternal sedation, infant removed, adoption expedited, names, numbers, signatures, cold ink documenting a theft disguised as procedure. His father's signature stared back at him from the bottom of the page. Precise, practiced, unshakably confident. The penstroke carried none of the hesitation now twisting his own stomach. He could almost hear the older man's voice. It was necessary. It was cleaner this way. Family first. Legacy above sentiment. Those phrases had carved his childhood into shape. Now they read like explanations offered at a crime scene. Finally. Downstairs, unaware of the file now tearing through the foundations of the house, Maria moved along the service corridor with a laundry cart in front of her. The cart's wheels squeaked over a single uneven tile, a sound she normally ignored. Today it grated. The air felt thicker as if the walls themselves held their breath. Eyes followed her longer than usual, then jerked away when she looked back. Uneasily. She had not forgotten the scream from the records room. It had sliced through the previous night like a jagged crack in glass. Too raw to belong to ordinary fear, she had stood frozen in the service hallway, fingers gripping a stack of folded towels, listening as the sound was quickly swallowed by authority and protocol. No one mentioned it at dinner. That silence told her more than panicked rumors ever could. On the monitor in his study, the Tycoon watched her in grainy grayscale as she moved between floors. He told himself it was surveillance, nothing more. Protecting the property, protecting his mother. The lie tasted thin even inside his own mind. The camera caught small details he had missed in person. The way Maria's shoulders tightened when she passed a guard, how her jaw clenched briefly before relaxing again. Involuntarily, he muted the security feed's audio and listened instead to the echo of the lullaby still lodged in his memory. It replayed with cruel clarity, overlaying itself onto images of a different kitchen, a different night, a different woman whose voice had carried the same phrasing, the same breath between syllables. Memory and present overlapped until he could not tell which ache belonged to which decade anymore. It would not dissolve. The security chief arrived mid-morning, file in hand, expression carefully neutral. He placed a second folder beside the first, its edges still crisp from recent opening. "We accessed the sealed registry," he said. There was resistance. Not technical, political. The Tycoon didn't flinch. "Outcome?" he asked. The chief opened the newer file halfway, revealing copied forms, hospital notes, and a single attached photograph that did not match any he expected. Ever. The woman in the grainy image was younger, her hair longer, her eyes bright in a way illness had not yet dulled. She stood outside a modest clinic holding a swaddled bundle that had been clumsily blurred by an old redaction mark. He recognized her instantly and painfully, his mother, decades earlier, standing in front of a life she had been told could not be saved, yet clearly had been handled. Beneath the photograph, a notation, maternal notification denied at request of patron. The word patron slammed into him harder than any title. He did not need a name. The structure was familiar, a wealthy benefactor smoothing complications with signatures. His father had always believed some truths were too heavy for women, for children, for those without the stomach to wield power. He had called it mercy. It tasted like erasure. "We traced the adoption channel," the chief continued. "The infant was registered under a temporary surname, then transferred again within months. Final placement records were sealed, but we pulled a cross-reference from an agency audit years later." He tapped a paper with one blunt finger. "Maria Isabel Reyes. Same birth date, same emergency delivery, same clinic. The odds of error are statistically irrelevant. Sir, it's the same child. Completely, undeniably." The Tycoon's fingers curled slowly against the edge of the desk. His pulse pounded in his ears, loud enough to drown out the hum of the climate system. He thought of Maria beside his mother's bed, humming that song with a tenderness that had made his chest ache. Thought of her photograph he had glimpsed only in passing, tucked into a folded uniform on the laundry cart, familiar features he'd dismissed as coincidence. "What about her mother?" he asked. The question surprised even him with how quickly it emerged. The chief hesitated, then slid another sheet forward. "Alive," he said. "She was told the baby died shortly after birth." The attending physician signed off on a loss. The record was later amended to classify it as a transfer under medical discretion. She never saw the correction. She believes she buried an empty coffin. The image that sentence conjured nearly staggered him. A woman standing at a grave that held nothing, mourning a void carefully constructed by men in suits. It was the kind of cruelty that cloaked itself in paperwork and procedure, leaving no blood on anyone's hands, just ink, just distance, just a girl growing up somewhere else, carrying a lullaby like a scar she didn't know was inherited. Quiet, invisible, permanent. Down in the kitchen, the staff whispered in fragments, never finishing their sentences when Maria entered. She could feel words hanging in the air behind her back, pressing against the tiled walls. "Records," someone murmured. "Adoption," another voice answered, quickly shushed. She kept her head down, spooned soup, ate 3 distracted mouthfuls, then pushed the bowl away. Hunger was a luxury on days when history stirred. Survival devoured appetite first. In her small room, she unwrapped the photograph again. The edges had grown soft from years of handling. The woman in it smiled at someone just outside the frame, eyes crinkling with a joy Maria recognized only from very early memories. She had been told different stories about why that face disappeared. Illness, debt, immigration trouble. None of them had fit. But the ache those stories left behind had felt truthful. She traced the outline of the woman's hand with her thumb. It was a worker's hand, fingers strong, knuckles slightly rough, the same kind of hand she saw now when she looked down at her own. She had never believed in destiny. Destiny felt like something rich people invented to explain the harm they caused. But patterns? Patterns she believed in, and this house was full of them. Layered. Repeating. That afternoon she returned to his mother's room with fresh linens and medication. The older woman was awake, her eyes clearer than they had been in days. "You came back," she said, voice papery but certain. Maria offered a small smile. "I said I would," she replied. The woman studied her face with disconcerting intensity, as though reading a language inscribed beneath skin rather than ink on documents. Unavoidable. Undeniable. "They lied to both of us," the old woman whispered suddenly. No preamble. No drift. Just impact. Maria's hand stilled over the blanket. "Who did?" she asked. The woman blinked slowly, eyes glistening. "Men who thought blood was theirs to rearrange," she said. "Men who believed women forget if you give them enough pills and distance." Maria's chest tightened. The pieces she'd been holding separately shifted, trying to lock together. The Tycoon stepped into the doorway without announcing himself. His shadow stretched ahead of him, long and defined across the floor. Maria felt his presence before she fully turned, the air condensing with his arrival. Their eyes met briefly. Something raw flickered in his, quickly shuttered. He closed the door behind him with a quiet click that sounded to Maria very much like the beginning of a verdict. For someone. He moved closer to the bed, not to Maria. "Mother," he said softly. The word felt strange in his mouth, heavy with unspoken questions. The older woman's gaze shifted to him, sharpened by a clarity that illness hadn't managed to steal. "You opened it," she said, not asking. He didn't pretend confusion. "Yes." Her fingers tightened around Maria's hand as if bracing for impact from both past and present. "Together, you let them take her," he said quietly. No accusation, just an awful flatness. His mother flinched as if struck. "They said she died," she answered. "Your father. He signed papers while I slept. When I woke, they told me mourning was my duty, not questions." Her voice cracked. "I tried once to ask again. He threatened to have me declared unfit if I didn't stop. So I obeyed." Silenced. Maria felt the room tilt slightly under the weight of those words. She had spent years suspecting cruelty shaped her life, but hearing its outline spoken aloud sent a chill through her bones. "You didn't know I was alive," she said, the sentence emerging before she had consciously chosen it. The older woman turned back to her, eyes wet. "I hoped," she whispered. "Hope is a stubborn kind of knowing." The Tycoon looked between them, his mother clutching the hand of the maid he could no longer pretend was just staff. Maria, standing at the collision point of two lives rearranged without consent. The file on his desk had changed everything on paper. This moment changed everything in flesh. "Then we are all victims of the same decision," he said slowly. "The question is what we do with it now." Finally, the room did not breathe again after his sentence. It held the question like a suspended weight between three people who no longer fit their old roles. The machines hummed with indifferent steadiness, measuring a body that had just become the axis of a buried history. Maria's fingers were still wrapped in the older woman's fragile grip. The Tycoon stood at the edge of the bed, no longer certain which of them he was meant to protect first. He had built his life on choosing outcomes, on forcing direction when nature hesitated. Now the choice he had named hovered without instructions, naked and uneasy. His mother's eyes shimmered as she searched his face. Not for authority this time, but for absolution. Maria did not look at him at all. Her attention stayed fixed on the woman she had been separated from by ink and sedation and silence. "I don't want secrets anymore," the old woman said faintly. "They make monsters of ordinary men." She closed her eyes, as if the statement cost more strength than her body could spare. The Tycoon felt the words lodge in him with unexpected weight. His father had called himself many things. Protector, builder, provider. Ordinary had never been one of them. Monster, perhaps, was closer than he wanted to admit. Maria gently eased her hand free so she could adjust the pillow behind the older woman's neck. The movement was instinctive, maternal in its softness. The Tycoon watched it with attention he could not name. That same motion had existed in his childhood, in a kitchen that no longer existed, performed by a woman whose absence had shaped him as surely as presence would have. "I should go," Maria said quietly, stepping back. There was no fear in her voice now, only caution. The Tycoon turned toward her. No, he said. The word emerged too quickly, too forcefully. He tempered it at once. Not yet. This isn't finished. His mother's eyelids fluttered. Maria paused, caught between obedience learned from survival and refusal born of truth. Outside the room, the corridor had filled with a subtle alertness. Staff moved more slowly, more quietly. News never stayed contained inside wealth. It only traveled in finer currents. The guards had shifted positions again, no longer merely observing but separating. Not to imprison, to stage. The Tycoon felt the architecture adjusting to a narrative he had not authorized. That realization unsettled him far more than open rebellion ever could. He guided Maria into the adjacent sitting room with a motion that was careful enough to disguise command as invitation. The space was subdued in cream and soft gray, designed for quiet visits, gentle order. His mother's nurse lingered near the doorway, concern etched into her eyes. 5 minutes, the Tycoon said. It was not a request. The nurse nodded and withdrew, the door closing with deliberate softness. They stood facing one another across the low table. Maria held herself straight, palms resting lightly against the edge as if anchoring to something physical could keep her centered. The Tycoon did not sit. Neither did she. The symmetry felt deliberate, fragile, newly configured. Your mother is alive, he said. The statement hung without framing. Maria's breath stuttered against her will. I know, she replied after a moment. I've known for years that she wasn't dead. I just didn't know where they put her. The simplicity of the confession stripped the room of any lingering pretense. His jaw tightened. They told her you died, he said. Maria's eyes flickered, a brief flare of pain contained behind steadiness. That makes us even, she said. Both orphans by the same lie. The Tycoon felt the charge of those words reverberate through him. Even, as if loss could be balanced. He moved closer to the table. She's under monitored placement, he said. Not imprisoned, hidden. I can reach her, I already know where. Maria's restraint finally fractured. Her fingers curled into the table's edge, wood creaking faintly beneath pressure. You can't decide that either, she said, voice low, controlled. You don't get to rearrange us again. He absorbed the rebuke without flinching. I'm not offering to decide, he said. I'm offering to remove the people who once did. Silence stretched between them, taut with contested authority. She searched his face, wary of generosity shaped by guilt rather than understanding. And what do you want in return? She asked. The question landed with surgical precision. His answer surprised them both. Nothing from you, he said. But something from myself. He hesitated, then spoke again. I won't shield the truth from her. Or from the board. Or from whatever remains of my father's influence. Not anymore. The words felt like a public renunciation made in a private room. Maria's suspicion softened only slightly, not yet convinced. From the bedroom beyond the wall came a faint sound. His mother shifting, restless again. Maria turned instinctively toward it. The Tycoon watched that turn closely, recognizing something of himself in it. The compulsion to move toward the fragile center instead of away from it. He had learned the opposite lesson as a boy. Now the house itself seemed to be unteaching him. That afternoon, the boardroom convened without formal summons. Power had sensed disruption and gathered to stabilize itself. The Tycoon entered late, eyes colder than usual. 12 faces turned toward him, polished and alert. Whispers stilled. He took his place at the head of the table without greeting. We will be opening historical family trusts, he said, and dissolving 2 foundations whose origins are no longer acceptable. Murmurs rippled across the table. Those foundations protect, one director began. The Tycoon lifted a hand. The gesture was quiet. Absolute. They protected something we should never have needed hiding, he said. That protection ends. The room froze in the wake of that certainty. Financial collapse was not threatened. Moral exposure was. That distinction unsettled them more deeply than loss ever could. Meanwhile, Maria remained with the old woman, whose clarity surged and faded like unstable light. You look like her, the woman whispered again. tracing Maria's cheek with trembling fingers as if confirming her reality by touch. Maria swallowed against the contact. "You were supposed to raise me," she said softly, not accusing. The old woman nodded weakly. "They stole time from both of us," she said, "and taught him how." The implication hung heavy. Maria glanced toward the door. She could almost feel the Tycoon's presence through walls now, not as threat, as unresolved truth. "He's not like his father," she said after a moment, surprised to hear herself defending him. The old woman studied her with quiet wisdom. "He learned too well what his father taught," she said. "That's not the same as becoming him." Down the corridor, the Tycoon returned to his study to find a new envelope waiting on his desk. Not from security, from legal. He opened it with controlled impatience. Inside lay documents he had not requested. Testamentary alterations his father had prepared years before death but never enacted. A contingency the old man had designed without warning. The clauses smelled of preemptive control, and at the center of them, Maria's surname appeared again. As beneficiary, shock registered, sharp and unguarded. His father had planned for this, or feared it, or both. The man had anticipated the return of what he had buried and tried to purchase absolution in advance. The Tycoon felt a cold anger coil through him. Legacy was no longer an idea. It was an aggressive presence still attempting to dictate outcomes from the grave. In the mother's room, Maria felt the environment shift again. Nurses exchanged looks that carried too much information. One whispered something into the intercom. She sensed escalation without seeing it. When the Tycoon entered moments later, his expression was tightly controlled. "Your name is in my father's final trust," he said without prelude. Maria stared at him, disbelief rippling across her composure. "As what?" she asked. "As a safeguard," he replied. "A conditional heir." The words landed with surreal force. Maria let out a short, incredulous breath that almost resembled a laugh. "So he stole a child?" she said. "Hid her, erased her mother, then named her as insurance?" The Tycoon did not argue. There was nothing left to obscure, only to confront. "Yes," he said. The old woman stirred, distressed by the rising tension. Maria moved back to her side automatically, grounding the moment in care. "I don't want his money," she said quietly. "I want my life. Not some apology written in numbers." Her voice did not shake this time. The Tycoon felt something in himself rearrange around that truth. He had spent a lifetime translating everything into transactions. This refused conversion. The board's resistance manifested before nightfall. Legal injunctions attempted to delay disclosure. Media silence was purchased aggressively. The Tycoon dismantled each obstruction with ruthless efficiency, not as damage control, but as excavation. "Let it come into the light," he ordered. "Let it be ugly." Control had once meant concealment. Now it meant exposure. The reversal cost him allies within hours. He did not regret it. By evening, the old woman's energy waned again. Maria sat beside her, humming without words. The Tycoon stood in the doorway, observing with unfamiliar stillness. Power had left his shoulders. Vulnerability took its place with awkward weight. "We'll find her tomorrow," he said finally. Maria did not turn. "And then?" she asked. The question was not about logistics. He hesitated. The answer was no longer governed by strategy. "Then whatever truth demands," he said. The room felt suspended between consequence and relief. Maria slowly nodded, though uncertainty thread through the gesture. She understood now that there was no version of this where something did not break. Families built on subtraction always fractured when addition finally arrived. Outside the windows, the house stood brilliant and exposed for the first time. Light no longer served as ornament. It functioned as witness. And somewhere beyond the gates, beyond the carefully managed walls and documents and restraint, a woman waited who had named a dead child for 24 years. Tomorrow would tear that grave open, for all of them. Morning arrived without softness. Light spilled across the estate in unfiltered shards, striking marble and glass with a brilliance that felt indiscreet. The house, once a fortress of controlled shadow, now seemed unwilling to hide. Maria stood at the edge of the courtyard in her uniform, hands clasped loosely in front of her, feeling the cold stone beneath her shoes and the colder anticipation inside her chest. Today was no longer theory. It was movement. The Tycoon watched her from the upper balcony without announcing his presence. She sensed him before she saw him, the way one senses a storm through pressure rather than sound. He descended the steps slowly, not with his usual authority, but with something closer to restraint. A black car waited beyond the iron gates, engine already idling. The world beyond the property had been sealed off for years. Today, it would be crossed. His mother slept through the final checks. The doctor had insisted she remain behind. Her strength had surged and retreated too many times for risk now. Maria had stood by the bed when the decision was made, listening as the old woman protested in thin, furious whispers. "You go," she had told Maria with trembling insistence. "I waited long enough. I don't need to see her to know she's real." "You do." Maria had kissed her forehead before leaving the room. Now, the car door opened. No ceremony, no press, only motion. Maria stepped inside without asking if she should sit in the back or front. The Tycoon entered after her and closed the door himself. The quiet that followed was not empty. It was alert, electric, braced. As the gate slid open, Maria felt something inside her loosen that had been clenched her entire life. The city appeared briefly, then dissolved into distance as concrete gave way to long, open roads. The Tycoon spoke only once in the first hour. "You don't owe me conversation," he said. Maria nodded without looking at him. She had no interest in easing his discomfort. Her hands rested on her knees, knuckles pale, pulse steady but relentless. Every mile stripped another layer of denial from her body. Ahead, somewhere beyond the horizon, waited the woman who had shaped her first sound. The drive unfolded into farmland and dust. The landscape shifted gradually from engineered precision to the quiet chaos of labor. Fences leaned, fields stretched without symmetry. The earth itself felt older here, less willing to be ordered. When the car finally slowed beside a narrow dirt road, Maria felt the air change. The Tycoon turned the engine off and sat for a moment longer, as if bracing for something he could not protect her from. "She doesn't know," he said quietly. Maria's voice did not waver. "Then neither did I." They walked the final distance on foot. The house at the end of the road was small, weathered, practical. No ornament. No walls designed to impress or intimidate. Just structure. Smoke curled faintly from a chimney. The scent of wet soil and wood filled Maria's lungs with something dangerously close to memory. She stopped several paces from the door. For the first time, fear arrived. Not fear of truth. Fear of belonging. The Tycoon waited behind her, deliberately not stepping forward. Authority could not lead here. He understood that, without needing explanation. Maria raised her hand and knocked once. The sound echoed inside the modest home and traveled straight through her bones. Footsteps approached slowly. The door opened. The woman who stood there bore no grandeur, no cinematic reveal. She wore worn denim and an old sweater, her hair pulled back with practical familiarity. Her face froze when she saw Maria, not with recognition, with instinct, the kind that arrives before logic. Her hand trembled against the doorframe as her eyes traced Maria's features like a language she hadn't spoken in decades. "You look like her," she whispered hoarsely. Maria swallowed. "You look like me." The words shattered the fragile stretch of seconds between them. The woman's breath hitched violently. Her free hand flew to her mouth. "No," she whispered, already shaking her head as if denial could reverse decades. "They told me. They made me. Her knees buckled. Maria moved without thinking, crossing the space and catching her before she could fall. Suddenly, the distance between past and present collapsed into touch. They stood trembling together in the doorway. The Tycoon remained several steps back, an outsider by necessity. The woman clung to Maria's arms with desperate disbelief. "You're warm," she whispered. "They said you were cold when you left. They said..." Her voice broke completely. Maria felt the words press into her ribs like a bruise that had never healed. "They lied," Maria said steadily. "They lied to both of us." The woman let out a sound that was not quite a sob and not quite a cry. It carried every night she had spent calling into empty space. For long moments, neither of them moved. Then, with trembling determination, The woman stepped aside. "Come in," she said. "Both of you. If I don't see you inside this house, I might still believe I'm dreaming." Inside, the home was simple and lived in. Photographs lined one wall. None of them included Maria, but all of them included the shadow of her absence. Childhoods frozen in frames belonged to other children, proof of time that had not waited. The Tycoon scanned the room with quiet discomfort. This place carried no markers of power, only continuity, the kind that does not require permission to exist. The woman fixed tea with unsteady hands. Maria watched the motion with an ache so sharp she had to steady herself against the table. Every movement matched her own without rehearsal. When the cups were set down, neither of them reached for one immediately. They simply looked at each other, both waiting for the other to speak first and fearing what would follow. "I named you Elena," the woman said at last. Maria inhaled slowly. "They renamed me Maria." The woman closed her eyes. "I sang to you every day," she whispered, "until they took you from my arms while I was asleep. I woke with milk in my chest and no child to feed." The sentence broke something open in that small kitchen. Maria felt the echo of it in her own body, in the way her childhood had been shaped by someone who had vanished without explanation. The Tycoon shifted, uneasy. "My father arranged the documents," he said quietly. The confession did not seek forgiveness. It acknowledged consequence. The woman finally looked at him directly. "Your father took my daughter," she said flatly. "Your money paid for my silence without my consent." She did not raise her voice. That restraint made the accusation devastating. He accepted it without retreat. Silence followed. Dense. Necessary. Then Maria asked the question she had carried her entire life. "Why didn't you come for me?" The woman's face crumpled. "I tried," she said. "Once. They showed me a grave. They threatened me with imprisonment if I ever returned. They said your death would become my crime if I spoke again." Her shoulders shook. "I was young. I was afraid. And I thought fear meant obedience." Maria absorbed the truth without flinching. By late afternoon, the initial storm gave way to something quieter and more piercing. Recognition turned into familiarity. Hands brushed without tension. The woman prepared food for Maria with an urgency that bordered on ritual. The Tycoon watched from the periphery, the weight of his family's actions settling into him with increasing clarity. When the sun lowered into amber behind the fields, Maria stepped outside alone for a moment. The Tycoon followed at a respectful distance. "You don't have to stay out here," she said without turning. "I know." She folded her arms around herself. "I don't know what to do with all of this." He paused beside her. "Not too close." "Neither do I," he admitted. The shared uncertainty bridged more than power ever could. From the doorway, the woman watched them. That night ended without resolution. No plan was drawn, no papers were signed. Truth had surfaced too recently to be shaped into structure. When Maria finally returned to the car, the woman gripped her hands tightly, as if afraid she would dissolve back into myth. "You're real," she kept repeating. "I touched you. That means you're real." Maria nodded through silent tears. As the car pulled away, Maria did not look back immediately. When she finally did, the small figure in the doorway still stood watching, as though holding vigil for a life that had briefly returned and might vanish again. The Tycoon drove without speaking. The road stretched long and dark ahead. Behind them, a past had reopened. Ahead of them, consequences waited. And neither of them yet knew which would prove more difficult to endure. The return to the estate unfolded in near silence. The road unspooled beneath the tires like a ribbon of consequence, each mile carrying the weight of what had been said and what had been left unfinished. Maria watched the streak of darkness through the window, her reflection wavering against it, unfamiliar and newly fragile. Inside her chest, grief and relief braided so tightly they were indistinguishable. The Tycoon kept his eyes on the road, hands steady, jaw set, as if motion itself were the only thing holding everything together. They arrived after midnight. The house no longer felt like a fortress. Light glowed behind a few distant windows, quiet signs of wakefulness that felt less like surveillance now and more like concern. Maria stepped out of the car and froze on the stone path. The air tasted different at this hour, cooler, honest, stripped of ceremony. She realized with a sudden shock that for the first time in her life, she had chosen to return somewhere, not been carried or placed or assigned. Inside, the nurse met them in the corridor, face pale with apology. "She's been asking for you," she said to Maria. On and off all evening. The Tycoon felt the words strike low and deep. He had not earned many second chances with his mother. He nodded once and stepped aside so Maria could pass first. Authority yielded to necessity without announcement. The bedroom was dim, lit by a single lamp pulled close to the bed. The old woman lay awake, eyes brighter than they had been in days. When Maria entered, recognition lit unmistakably across her face. "You went," she whispered. It wasn't a question. Maria moved to her side at once. "Yes," she said. "She's alive." The older woman's breath hitched with a sound that was half relief, half mourning. "She forgave me," Maria added softly, not entirely sure if that was true, only that it felt necessary to say. The Tycoon stood at the foot of the bed, a witness rather than a center. For once, he did not try to measure what forgiveness might cost or buy. His mother reached for his hand with surprising clarity. "You saw her," she said. "Your doing." It was the closest thing to gratitude he could remember her offering in years. It unsettled him more than anger ever had. In the days that followed, the house changed in ways too subtle to name but too profound to mistake. Staff moved with a gentleness that had never been demanded, but now seemed instinctive. Doors were left ajar. Music drifted into spaces that had once insisted on silence. The Tycoon canceled meetings without explanation. The board fumed in distant conference rooms, their objections muffled by legal injunctions. He dismantled one by one with relentless calm. News did not stay buried. It never does. A single investigative journalist caught the scent of altered records and quiet settlements. Then another. By the end of the week, questions began circulating beyond the estate walls, about foundations, trusts, sealed adoptions. The Tycoon answered none of them publicly. Instead, he released what could not be denied: documents, signatures, dates, truth without narrative, evidence without defense. The story built itself around the absence of denial. Maria watched it unfold from the margins, astonished by how swiftly power crumbled once faced with what it could not repurpose. One evening, she sat alone in the old sitting room, the one he had guided her into days earlier. The window was open now, carrying in the sound of distant traffic and night insects, a reminder that the world had not paused for their reckoning. The Tycoon appeared in the doorway without announcement. He hesitated as if learning a new etiquette. "She wants to see you," he said. Maria nodded and rose without hesitation. The woman waited at a video screen beside the bed. Weakness kept her from traveling, but will had propelled her into this connection. When the image flickered on, Maria felt the same jolt of recognition as the first moment at the door, though now tempered by memory. The woman's eyes shimmered. "You look like you're standing straighter," she said with a faint smile. Maria laughed quietly, surprised at the sound of it. "I feel heavier," she admitted, "but also clearer." They spoke simply. About weather, about the house, about the fields at dusk. Small things that stitched silence into continuity. The Tycoon remained behind the camera's edge, careful not to intrude, though every word anchored him to a history he had tried to outrun without knowing its shape. When the call ended, the room felt cleaner somehow, like a storm had finally passed. Later that night, he stood alone in the study with his father's trust documents spread across the desk. The conditional clauses read now like a confession he had postponed. Insurance, leverage, a contingency meant to maintain control even beyond the grave. Maria's name appeared where allegiance once would have been bought. He closed the folder with deliberate restraint. Legacy, he realized, was only dangerous when allowed to operate unseen. He requested a final legal review. The board threatened injunctions and public battles. He welcomed the confrontation. For once, conflict aligned with clarity. The following morning, Maria packed her small room with steady hands. There was no urgency, only intention. When the Tycoon found her folding a final blouse into her bag, he paused at the threshold. "You don't have to leave," he said. It was not framed as command. She met his gaze calmly. "I'm not leaving," she replied. "I'm choosing where I stand." They walked together into the courtyard as the sun rose pale over stone and glass. "I don't know what we are to each other now," she said. He considered the question longer than he usually allowed himself. "Neither do I," he answered at last. "But I know what I won't be anymore." The admission felt raw between them. From the bedroom above, his mother watched the two figures cross the open space. She closed her eyes with something close to peace. By evening, the journalists camped beyond the gates. Cameras waited. Questions sharpened. The story the world demanded collided with the truth they were still learning how to hold. Maria stood near the window of the service corridor, listening to distant voices call his name. The Tycoon joined her, not as shield, but as companion. "Tomorrow changes everything," he said. She nodded. "Tomorrow only proves what today already is." They stood in that narrow stretch of quiet between consequence and confession, and neither of them pretended the storm would be gentle. Morning came without delicacy. Light pressed against the glass walls of the estate as if the day itself were impatient with secrecy. Outside the iron gates, the crowd had already gathered. Journalists, cameras, strangers drawn by instinct toward fracture. Sound traveled differently there now, no longer absorbed by wealth and distance. The house, once designed to mute the world, had become an instrument amplifying it. On the upper floor, the Tycoon stood alone in the corridor, his reflection broken across the polished window panels. Below him, people moved like restless currents. For the first time in his life, the attention he had cultivated no longer belonged to him alone. It aimed itself toward the truth he had finally stopped deflecting. Behind him, Maria's footsteps approached. Quiet, deliberate. He felt the difference in them immediately. No hesitation, no learned deference. When he turned, he noticed what was missing before what was present. She was no longer wearing her uniform. The navy dress she had chosen was simple, unadorned, hers. The folded fabric of the maid's clothes rested inside the small bag at her side like a shed skin. He understood the symbol without words. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them had changed since their first meeting. It was no longer guarded. It was shared. "She's awake," he said finally. They entered his mother's room together. The light inside was softer than the world beyond the gates. Curtains filtered the morning into pale gold. The machines whispered, steady but subdued, as if conscious they were no longer the only measure of life in the room. The old woman lay propped higher than usual against the pillows, eyes clearer than they had been in years, awareness burning thin but bright. When she saw Maria, her face shifted with an emotion too layered to name. Recognition, regret, reverence, all braided. "You're not wearing it," she said faintly. Maria stepped closer and took her hand. It stopped being mine. The old woman's fingers tightened weakly around hers. "Good." Then she looked at her son. "I dreamed last night," she whispered, for the first time in a long while. He moved closer without realizing it. "What did you dream?" he asked. Her lips curved with fragile satisfaction. "That both my children were standing where the light could see them at the same time." The sentence settled over all three of them, like a quiet benediction. "It's time," the Tycoon said. Downstairs, the courtyard waited like a held breath. When the front doors opened, the sound crashed inward in a living wave. Voices tangled. Shutters fired. Questions disintegrated into fragments before completing themselves. The Tycoon stepped forward first, not as shield, not as commander, but as a man walking into consequence without armor. Maria followed several paces behind. Every instinct trained into her by years of invisibility screamed at her to lower her head. She did not. She fixed her gaze straight ahead, feeling the sun strike her face without permission, without mercy. Heat, noise, vision. Everything arrived at once, but she did not retreat. The cameras found her immediately. "Is it true she was taken? Who paid for the adoption? Are you related to him?" The Tycoon raised one hand. The crowd did not obey, but it slowed, just enough. "My family altered records," he said clearly. "A woman was told her child died when she had not. A child was relocated without consent. That injustice existed because my father believed ownership extended to blood." His voice did not shake. "That child is Maria." She stepped forward before he could say more. "They told my mother I was dead," she said. Her voice cut through the noise with raw steadiness. They told me I was abandoned. Everything I became was built on a lie made convenient by wealth. She breathed in once, deeply. I'm not here for vengeance. I'm here for visibility. They don't get to decide who I am anymore. The crowd shifted. Some listened. Some fed on the chaos. The truth, once released, could not control what it awakened. From the bedroom window above, the old woman watched through trembling glass. The sound of her breathing grew uneven as Maria spoke. When the girl's voice faltered for half a second, the old woman whispered into the emptiness, "Stand, Nina. Stand," and Maria did. Later, when the courtyard finally emptied and fragments and questions exhausted themselves into speculation, the estate felt disoriented by quiet. Rooms echoed differently now, as if walls had been listening all along and were uncertain how to resume their assigned roles. In the sitting room, Maria sat alone for the first time since morning. Her hands were steady now. The Tycoon entered without ceremony. The posture he carried was no longer shaped by defense. It held fatigue and something like humility. "It's done," he said. She looked at him without accusation. "It's exposed." He exhaled, a breath he seemed to have been holding for decades. "I released the final documents. Trusts, foundations, sealed inheritances, all opened. No leverage left buried." He hesitated. "My father prepared safeguards. I disabled them completely." She nodded once. Not as approval, as acknowledgement. From the doorway, the nurse appeared again. "She's asking for you both." They returned to the bedroom together. The old woman's strength had faded again, but her mind remained luminous. "You changed the story outside," she told Maria. "Not for blood. For truth." Her fingers slid weakly along Maria's wrist one last time. Then she turned her gaze to her son. "You broke a chain I couldn't break." His throat closed. That night, the house did not sleep. Neither did the woman waiting across the fields. Maria returned to the small rural home alone. She did not knock this time. The door opened before her hand reached it. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Recognition no longer arrived like lightning. It moved like gravity now. Quiet. Inevitable. The woman reached out, hesitating just enough to honor choice, then touched Maria's cheek, as if learning the reality of it again. "You came back," she whispered. "I wasn't allowed before," Maria replied. "Now I am." They stood in that threshold longer than comfort required, longer than fear allowed. When they finally moved inside, it was without urgency, without ceremony. Food waited on the stove. Life continued. Later, as evening settled itself into the fields, they sat together on the porch steps. No confessions remained. Only presence. Back at the estate, the Tycoon stood alone on the balcony where power once felt absolute. Now it felt accountable. For the first time, the city lights did not mirror conquest. They reflected uncertainty, and he did not turn away from it. Days passed. The story rebuilt itself in public. Investigations deepened. Names surfaced. Institutions wavered. The myth of a flawless legacy disassembled with methodical patience. Maria watched none of it. She lived. Weeks later, she returned once more to the estate. Not as staff, not as subject. As herself, she stood again in the corridor where the song had first crossed the distance between two lives. Silence filled the space where sound once had ruled. It was not emptiness anymore. It was peace shaped by consequence. The Tycoon joined her without announcing himself. "You don't have to come back here," he said. She studied the corridor one final time. "I know," she replied. "That's why this is goodbye." He lowered his head in quiet acceptance. As she walked away through the wide open doors, no one stopped her. Not guards, not wealth, not history. And as the light of the world claimed her once more, neither of them remained who they had been when the song first began.